So, dear all, welcome, very welcome to our roundtable, the little divergence within Imperial Eastern Europe, economic institution, economic development and peripherality. Very long and very sophisticated title. And now I switch into Ukrainian and I will say a few words about our participants of the roundtable, and then I will pass microphone to our colleagues. So I will speak now in Ukrainian and you will understand how the system works, right? Отже, перш за все хочу подякувати.
To start with, allow me to express the gratitude to the Center for Urban History for hosting this event here, and also to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies supporting the travel of our colleagues. Allow me to state that tonight we probably are having a historic event because this is the constellation of economic historians at this table. I wouldn't remember of any similar roundtables over the last 10 or 20 years even. Let me briefly introduce the speakers we have tonight. Please note that we printed out the details and their bios over there on the table. You could check these texts. So I would have to explain about their affiliations and why we invited these speakers and moderators. I will start with Tracy Dennison. She is the professor of History of Social Sciences from the California Institute of Technologies. She has authored many publications, but I believe the most important book is about the institutional framework for the Russian serfdom. Tracy is presenting the Russian Empire here as an expert in Russian Empire. Next to the west, Professor Max Schulze, the Professor of Economic History from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. Professor Schulze has authored many very interesting and significant articles, but we are particularly interested in one of them about the periphery, how the periphery things were periphery. And Professor Jacob Weisdorf, the Professor of Economics at the University of South Denmark and some other institutions as well. I'm really impressed with the broad coverage of the research interests of Professor Weisdorf, both in theme-wise and also time-wise, from Neolithic times to today, so probably we will be able to see this longue-durée perspective. Some words about two moderators that we have tonight. Dr. Tymofii Brik, who had his PhD at the University of Carlos III at Madrid, Spain. Before that, he studied at the University of Utrecht. He is founder of many important academic and social initiatives and institutions. Last year, he was awarded as the best sociologist of Ukraine. Who was presenting this award? Who gave this award to me? The sociological environment of Ukraine, the sociological community of Ukraine. All right, so he is representing sociology, but he is also dealing with economic history and history as such. And also Ms. Olena Petrenko, a historian who teaches at the university in Bochum. She recently published a book about Ukrainian women in the nationalist underground. She was also the co-editor of this special issue of this Ukraine Moderna that we are presenting tonight. This edition, this issue of the journal is very good news and the surprise that we are happy to see because it has just been printed and it's dedicated to the Ukrainian economic elites, and we shall continue the conversation about these elites further. And to wind up with my introduction, I would have to explain the procedure. I will now pass the microphone to Olena. She will take some 5 minutes to tell about this collection of essays. And then next, the floor will go to Tymofii, and then we will have about 40 minutes to discuss some of the aspects we have agreed about before. And then some 30 or 40 minutes we will take for questions and answers session. And you will have a chance to raise your comments or ask your questions. Thank you. Now I pass the floor to Olena. Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. allow me to express the gratitude to the Center for Urban History for this opportunity to host this roundtable discussion and also to present this new edition of this new magazine of Ukraine Moderna. And actually I only had a chance to check and page through this magazine several minutes ago. It is a final stroke of this conference that we had in Essen with the financial support of the Cultural Research Center 2 years ago. On the other hand, it was an opportunity to motivate some research in economic history and also to network and further work together, which actually was implemented as we organized this roundtable and tomorrow's workshop. In the focus of this conference and also of this journal are the economic elites, their continuity and transformations and changes in the time of political transformations. And the official title is The Economic Elites of Ukraine, a comparative historical perspective. We try to cover different epochs, both the Soviet time, the Austro-Hungarian period, the Polish rule in Ukraine. So we are happy to have an opportunity tonight to have more comparative perspectives that probably are not even included in this collection. We also know that there are several theme-based blogs from this journal, and would like to comment more on the essays included into this issue. Of course, the key message is that elites are the key notion for the understanding of the political transformations and the political structure of society, and in particular on the basis of Pareto approach of the circulation of elites. So we tried to consider the issue of continuity of elites that in Ukraine we have the exception of this post-Soviet period where we can feel this consolidated and well-cemented continuity in the economic elites. In fact, in Ukraine, since the 19th century and down to the 20th century, there was no this continuity. It was disrupted. So it would be interesting to trace some parallels. That's why we translated some articles, like by Dieter Ziter, who works at the University of Ruhr, and he is chair of the Department of Economic History, telling more about the continuity in the German elites. We found it very important to focus on the following aspects. One of them was to intertwine the periphery and the center, the development of the elites, because we know the 19th century was the time of emerging of new representatives of economic elites, from the metallurgy tycoons or sugar production tycoons down to engineers and also foreign entrepreneurs who came to the territory of Ukraine, the Russian Empire basically at that time. We also had several essays about the biographical research such as exploring how these perspectives motivated the individual actors change the networks of these economic elites, and also the discourse practices, how the individual representatives of this network of economic elites were perceived. For example, we have the article by Katerina Yeremeyeva focusing on the Soviet times, where she really focused on the sarcastic presentation and image of representatives of Soviet elites in the satirical magazines of Perets and Crocodile. So this is also the illustration how the elite is represented on the Republican, local and imperial level. And also it's very important to note and mention the political science and political studies articles combining the political and economic aspects, and I believe tomorrow we shall talk more about that. In particular, these are articles by Ms. Zubecka and Hanna Zanderbaum that we have in English in this magazine. Also, I should mention, I only have 5 minutes, I don't have time to focus on everything, but I need to mention the section forum where we have experts from Western Europe and from Eastern Europe who are discussing the issue of the lack of economic studies in Ukraine and the capacity, which is still rich there, to network, to have the interdisciplinary cooperation with sociologists, historians, economists. So we are discussing these aspects in this forum section. We are happy to disseminate this edition. You can buy it here tonight and it's 100 hryvnias worth. So after the presentation, should you be interested, I invite you to buy this issue. And of course, well, the libraries and the institutions that need these magazines, of course, we will present them to them for free. Now I will pass the microphone to Tymofii.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. And of course, thank you all for coming here tonight. Lviv is an amazing city with lots of interesting events. And I appreciate a lot that you have chosen to come here tonight to participate in our conversation about economic history, about very important and interesting aspects of how our societies came to exist. And of course, Tracy, Max, Jakob, thank you all for being here tonight with us. I'm very excited and thrilled to sit together with you at this table. It is a very rare occasion that so many great and famous scholars come to visit us and to sit together on one table. So I hope that you will enjoy this conversation just like I have already enjoyed it. I'm very happy. And today we're going to talk about very interesting aspects of your work because, well, for me as a sociologist, it is very interesting to see in your papers and in your books that when you speak about economic development, all of you address very complicated issues of social stratification. You speak about different occupational groups, about serfs and nobles. You speak about how economic wealth is distributed within regions and between regions. So this is, you paint a very complicated picture of economic development and inequalities. And today, inequalities, the issue of inequalities is on the rise in the global political agenda. Scholars, intellectuals, policymakers, they all speak about inequalities. They want to solve this issue, and I think that economic historians, you have a very unique position to speak about deep historical causal roots of what is happening today, and I hope that we will speak about this complexity today with you. But, you know, just to start our conversation and to sort of demonstrate that the concepts we are talking about could be addressed from very different theoretical perspectives, I'd like to ask all of you one simple question, and then I hope that then we will move on to more specific questions. And I will start with Jakob in this round. I'd really like you to answer what is Eastern Europe to all of you as economic historians. And I am addressing Jakob first because you're known to study very different regions from Northern Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa, and suddenly you have made this transition to be a scholar of Eastern Europe. So I'd really like to ask you, what was your motivation and how do you approach this concept in your studies?
Thank you very much for this really clever and at the same time annoying question. Asked to someone who's really not an expert on Eastern Europe economic development. So on the question, what is Eastern Europe to me? The simple answer is, that's what I'm here to find out. But the more complex answer, or the way I like to look at it, compared to Western Europe, which I know a lot more about, is that Eastern Europe is the counterfactual to Western Europe.
Well, I hear some laughs, maybe of laughs of appreciation or maybe of disagreement. I don't know yet. So perhaps Tracy can jump in and.
I see what he means. It's what you set Western Europe against, right? But I would give a different answer. I think, to my mind, Eastern Europe, just as a concept, is a post-1945 notion. We all imagine, we think Eastern Europe, and we immediately think of the Soviet period, and we think of the various challenges that this part of Europe has faced in the Soviet period and then the post-Soviet transition period. But my own work is on a much earlier period, so Imperial Russia, up to, say, 1900, and I rarely think about it being Eastern Europe at all. I think that a lot of the questions that I'm interested in about growth and development, economic growth and development, about the distribution of income, about the opportunities people had, those are things we see in Southern Europe. Those are things we see in parts of Central Europe. Those are things we see in many other parts of the world. And in fact, I'm often resisting this categorization. You're an East Europeanist, you're a Russianist. No, I'm interested in questions of development, and they have actually commonalities well beyond Eastern Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much. And perhaps Max can also.
I do share Tracy's exposition in the sense it doesn't make that much sense to say, okay, this is Western Europe, that's Eastern Europe, and then trying to answer the very, very difficult, simple but very difficult question that you answered, because we don't quite know where the line lies. This is an entirely artificial distinction. If we think in terms of intellectual history, if we think in terms of cultural history, if we think in terms of political history or economic history, and you ask practitioners in these various fields, what is Eastern Europe and what is Western Europe, they'll give you completely different answers. And as an economic historian, I am interested in questions of comparative economic development. Why are some parts of Europe or some parts of the world rich and others poor? Why have some parts of the world grown rich despite the fact that they were initially quite poor, and others have overtaken or fallen behind despite the fact that initially they were relatively rich? And in that sense, simple geographical distinctions between East and West don't help us very much. What does help us, on the other hand, I think, to structure our thinking about how across space economic development differentiates itself between different parts of the world. Of course, in that sense, we might say distinguishing between East and West, North and South. South is helpful because it's a shorthand, because it helps us to summarize certain characteristics that our analyses would suggest were specific to certain places or certain spaces at certain periods of time. But to overstretch this concept of East versus West, I think, does not help us analytically at all.
So where do you start in your process as a researcher when you search these meaningful categories for comparative analysis? Do you start from the raw data and you say, well, the data will show me in a fancy way as a contemporary data analyst would run some complicated cluster analysis model and will expect the data to show where different regions lay on the map? Or do you start with a theoretical concept beforehand? Can you elaborate on your working process?
Well, I would, sorry, is this question addressed to me? I would start in the first instance with a question. What am I interested in? If, for instance, the issue is, why do we, for instance, have an empire like the Habsburg Empire, which is what I've worked on for quite some time? why is it that this place that straddles the geographical boundaries or the political boundaries between the West and the East, that's why it's often also referred to as East Central Europe or Central Europe, the very usage of these different qualifiers points already to the fact that we are perhaps not too comfortable to take simple geographical labels at face value. But when you address questions like that and then you ask, how come that the relatively rich, or that the richer parts of this empire of, on the eve of the First World War, more than 50 million people, that they are all in the so-called West, whereas the poor parts are all in the East or in the Southeast. And that then raises questions that go beyond merely looking at institutional characteristics, but invite, for instance, questions of historical economic geography. So here then, these labels, East, West, North, South, are quite useful in terms of organizing one's thoughts, but they are not necessarily particularly helpful in determining the analysis per se.
I see. Thank you very much. It seems like a very elaborated and comprehensive scheme. And yet, just to sort of move on with this subject, here in Ukraine, we live in a very specific historical moment. We're looking forward presidential elections. And a couple of days ago, one of the biggest magazines in Ukraine called Новое Время, New Time, they published an article with an interview of all major presidential candidates. So they were asked the same questions about policies and about the future of the country, and they were asked to propose a role model, which to answer a question, which politician or a historical figure has inspired these people in their life. And I think 5 out of 7 responded Lee Kuan Yew, the famous Prime Minister of Singapore, and you know this fame around him due to this phrase of catching up and how did his country evolved with time and became very successful. So this catching up mechanism is a buzzword today in Ukraine. Everyone is curious about this, and I know that this is also a very big and a very significant concept in economic history. So I really want to ask you this question: like, how would you describe this process in terms of economic history? Would you say that it is a relevant, meaningful category to compare Eastern or Western Europe in the 19th century, or maybe before, maybe in the early 20th century as well? Would you say that this is a meaningful category which you have worked with? Anyone?
Yes. Is the answer. I think it is a meaningful. Okay, sorry, I'm jumping in here. I do think it helps us to make sense of what we observe. And the question of catching up, the question is always who's going to supposedly catching up with whom, and what are our measures for that, but most importantly, why is that interesting in the first place? And I think the interest in the first place comes back to one of the issues that you raised at the very beginning of our session, namely the interest in inequality, very, very broadly conceived. And here I come back to a point I made earlier. Yeah, why are some parts of the world rich and others poor? And that implies already some interest in the question, how then do some parts of the world manage to catch up? In other words, what are the conditions that allow some participants in some actors to succeed, whereas others are not succeeding? Now that then raises a whole range of questions why that is so. And if we follow the reasoning of the father of catch-up theory, so to speak, Abramovitz, well, in principle, one could expect, all else being equal, that the relatively poor parts of the world have a chance to catch up with the rich, but this is subject to social capabilities. So only because you are poor does not necessarily mean that you will subsequently grow very, very fast. If the conditions are not there, if social capabilities are limited, then you run into trouble. And here I think the comparative study of Western Europe and Eastern Europe can really enlighten us about under which conditions are those processes that theoretically suggest that there should be a narrowing down in income differential. Under which conditions do they work and under which conditions do they not work? And I think that's an eminently historical issue.
Can I add to that? So I like Max's way of... Should I take the other one? So I like this way of thinking about economic development, that you have some leaders and there is someone trying to catch up. And there are a few things I would like to add to Max's view. One thing is that it's true that to some degree we've observed catching up among countries that fell behind in the Great Divergence, let's say. But I think we should also be aware that this is a bit of a dream world, in the sense that if the developed world continues to develop, and I think with the technological progress we see nowadays, really, really fast, they will take big jumps ahead, and then we're not going to observe catching up in the sense that the poor come closer to the richer. So in my mind, it will be a process whereby there's a step ahead of the leaders, and then there will be some catch-up, but then the leaders might step ahead again, and there's an opening gap. And I think we cannot expect catching up to just happen and the gap to just closing, as if this was in the cards the whole time. I think we should be aware that there might be more going on among the leaders that can take it in another direction.
But also going back to the previous question about the definitions and categories, what is West and what is not West, would you really say that empirically Eastern Europe had been disadvantaged in the process of catching up, or do you see more complicated variation that some Western countries had to catch up to other Western countries? So is this a meaningful interaction of these two terms, the division between West and East and catching up process?
Yes. Again,
I like your answers.
In a sense, it is useful. I tried to explain earlier on, I don't think we should take these labels East and West as too serious here. But they are quite handy, quite useful shorthand for summarizing what we analytically came to the conclusion are certain characteristics of particular spaces during particular periods. And we may say that there are certain similarities between, say, the Tsarist Empire in the late 19th century and, say, the province, the Austrian province of Galicia during the same period, or the Bukovina. This has to do with agriculture, but there may also be some institutional similarities. So if we want to work out why some regions in the 19th century, in this part of the world, and literally from here right deep into the territories that formerly belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, why some areas were successful in terms of catching up with the West. In the Habsburg Empire, unfortunately there was none, I would argue, whereas others were not. That helps us to understand those conditions that more generally may apply right across the world, in principle. But of course, as historians, we have to work out the specifics and try and distinguish a little bit. I think just to say there are just general rules working here, and with this we can explain Russian history or Habsburg history. I think we've all spent too much time trying to make sense of what we are looking at. That we want to be a little bit careful. But this concept of relative success or failure of economies in macroeconomic terms, that is quite helpful, I find, and we can meaningfully relate that to differences in performance across space.
Yeah, sure, Tracy.
I was just going to ask if I could say, I don't disagree. I just was wondering if I could say something about the limits of that, perhaps. Sure. I think that this notion of catching up, I mean, it is important, and we want to have basic measurements and standards of comparison. The measurement itself matters. So it can look as though a place, if you're looking at GDP statistics, that sort of thing, as though a place is catching up. But that actually doesn't tell us very much about the quality of life in those places and how people are experiencing economic growth and development. That is a much trickier matter. How the wealth is distributed across the population, also how the power is distributed across the population, how the opportunities are distributed across the population. And I do worry that without what Max referred to as social change, what I would call institutional change, which is something we really don't understand all that well yet, the glass ceiling is there. You can catch up, it's easy to go, I mean, the case people often point to is of course the Soviet economy under Stalin, right? You can go from very poor to catching up in macro indicators. Of course, that also applies to all of those things I said about what life is like for people on the ground. But it also, you hit a point where the possibilities for growth are stifled, and it's true that the places where that's not the case, as Jakob said, they're going to keep growing, and this is something that comes up even in discussions beyond Eastern Europe, right, with discussions about Asia today and the Chinese economy, and what sorts of fundamental institutional changes are required in order for growth to keep going. So just wanted to maybe sound a little pessimism.
I wouldn't approach it as a pessimistic note. I think that the theoretical clarity brings more joy and optimism. So, and
an empirical note.
And it's nice that you mentioned institutions, and you were talking about power and distribution of power, and you had written this brilliant book about the institutional framework of serfdom in Russia. And I thought also that this is a nice opportunity for us to talk about your book and maybe to tell about your book to the audience. So perhaps instead of talking only about catching up, we also can talk about convergence. We can speak how our societies in the world develop from being less democratic to be more democratic, what kind of political changes happened and how are they connected to economics. So perhaps you can just shed some light on your book. What was the institutional framework of serfdom in Russia? Why did it change? What were the consequences? And did it bring any sense of convergence with other Western societies? I will still use this label now, in terms of becoming slightly similar in terms of institutional frameworks.
Let me try and do this as briefly as possible. I mean, it's an interesting question for me because my current project is actually comparative, looking at the trajectories of Prussia and Russia and the emancipation legislation, and trying to understand how you get, and we'll be talking about this a bit tomorrow, very, very different outcomes from these two. But both had serfdom, both started in a similar institutional equilibrium, and by the 19th century, Prussia has broken free of this equilibrium, and Russia has not. It is still trapped in the same weak state equilibrium that it was in at the beginning. But I think that what, in the course of doing the research for the serfdom book, what became clear to me is that it's actually very difficult to articulate, and I'm going to use some terms that are kind of approximating things, though I realize there's a lot of scope for debate. But the institutions that you found in Northwest Europe that I think were important to enabling economic growth, very fundamental sorts of things, were lacking in Russia. And to give you an example of the kind of thing I mean, serfs were not formal legal people. They were owned by their landlords. And this mattered because their property rights were insecure. they were actually incredibly entrepreneurial people. This probably won't surprise anyone. You don't need a formal legal system for people to be creative and entrepreneurial. The problem is that they spend most of their time and resources getting around the law, getting around actually operating in a gray area where they're very much at the mercy of more powerful people who demand bribes from them, who demand that they participate in a much more corrupt system. And this means that you're not getting people channeling productive resources into things like infrastructure building, the kinds of projects you see, just to give an example, in England that made, before the Industrial Revolution, building roads privately, canals, figuring out, putting private money into projects that actually had spilled over into the larger society. So without the incentives to do that, where you're constantly having to pay people off in order to secure your own position, where you're reluctant to give anything or invest because you're worried that things might be taken from you, it's very precarious, you don't get the same kinds of development. And this is a very intricate, systemic problem. I mean, if you ask me how would you fix this? It's clearly, it permeates the whole society. And I think just one last thing I will say about that is, I also realized, I thought this would be very simple doing this project, to see these connections. Okay, there are these concrete institutions that are required in order to get economic development and growth. But what I realized is that a society is a lot like an organism, that these institutions are all interrelated. And you can't just change one of them and expect the whole society to change, right? And you often don't know how they're related. So you change one and then strange things start happening somewhere else. You have a pain in your knee when you just went for your ear to the doctor. And so it was incredibly revelatory to me in terms of thinking about the way, as a sociologist, you must appreciate this, the way a society works.
Exactly, I do really appreciate this answer, and if you have a sociologist in the room, sooner or later you're going to talk about two things: institutions and culture. So, and I'd really like to bring this issue of culture here, because we do want to understand how institutions work in the ecosystem, and how do people acquire institution, and how are they socialized to behave with respect to a given institutionalized norms and practices. So, and I think that the issue of culture is not so foreign for economists. I'm thinking about people like Sasha Becker, Jeremiah Dittmar, their studies of the Reformation, for instance. I think they really brought back the notion of culture to our understanding of economic development, but also a lot of clarity, because they try to intersect practices of different religious groups with their investment in education, for instance, in printing books, things like that. So I guess my question would be about this very issue. Do you find, or have you conducted, or do you think that this is an interesting, meaningful research to be done to study the divisions in culture, language barriers, how language, cultural norms, values travel from one Eastern society to another, and where is this invisible board in terms of culture, not only in terms of bureaucracy, state, and economics, but how can we apply this big idea of culture to studies of Western and Eastern societies?
In trying to answer that question and
No
following
pressure.
on, no pressure at all, and you're not going to get, well, maybe you will. Following on Tracy's approach, looking at things, it seemed to me that what you said is, if you give people, let's say at the bottom of society, agency, there's a good chance they will act in a way that might benefit society. And so what I heard you say is that if you get that institutional setting that provides agency, and if you have people that are creative, and if they do something that benefits society, especially investing in infrastructure, that will have effects beyond the individual but benefits society more broadly, then I think you will have development. And the way I look at it is that institutions are not enough, and that's where culture come in. And cultures differ, mentalities. You're going to hate me for saying that, but I do think that mentalities differ, at least for a while. And by that I mean, you give people agency that they're not used to, and if they have a mindset from a previous regime that prevents them from doing active things that can help society, they're not going to develop. But in my view, the good news is that it takes a generation to change a mentality. So, but you need the combination, you need the right institution, but you also need the right mentality.
Let me take up one point that Jakob made, and that's about creativity. I think it's not just an institutional issue that comes in here. If we think a little bit in Mockerian terms about the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the effects of the Enlightenment, and then go about 100 years before the actual onset of the Industrial, it is quite important for societies, we know now, to allow for curiosity to spread. And if you have quite restrictive societies, either on religious grounds or political grounds, the likelihood that you encourage intellectual creativity and out of sheer curiosity is bound to be somewhat lower than in societies where you have relatively little constraints on that. Now, I'm not going to say that this alone will do the job, but there is some interaction here between an institutional framework that allows this creativity to flourish and one that suppresses this kind of creativity or does not allow it to arise in the first place. That's one aspect. Another aspect I think that is quite important, and that's a very broad interpretation of culture. I did some work with my co-author Nico Wolf on, sounds a bit bizarre, on market integration, and we looked whether we could use price data from the late 19th century to predict whether certain areas would asymmetrically integrate or disintegrate in the case of the Habsburg Empire. And we did find that there is some controlling for the language composition of populations in the major cities in the Habsburg Empire, and taking the complete linguistic profile, which we took as a proxy for national identity. I think that speaks to your question about culture, that this does indeed have an impact on the way that places interacted with each other. So I would observe, for instance, that predominantly Magyar-speaking or predominantly German-speaking areas or predominantly Czech-speaking areas would develop preferences. In other words, that certain areas in the late 19th century, and this is a pointer to the impact of nationalism, would start to, in relative terms, disintegrate and reintegrate with other areas that would be linguistically or ethno-linguistically, as we put it, closer to each other. Now that has a very interesting longer-term implication. It speaks also to issues within the European Union, for instance, a multinational European setting. So we may have common institutions. We may have an ease, a considerable ease of exchange in goods across distance, but certain political or cultural events can actually change the kind of economic behavior that we display. And that is quite problematic. Problematic in the sense of raising big historical questions.
You had tapped
No,
into
I'm just
Signals
not at all. That was just the back of my mind. I will say something. I mean, I will maybe respectfully disagree with my colleagues, or maybe not disagree about culture being something important, but perhaps about the extent of the impact. I'm always very skeptical because culture is this, if we're talking about Eastern Europe, it's this thing that comes up all the time. You're an East Europeanist, you're a Russianist, you try to explain to people why similar things keep happening again and again. And they say it must be their culture, it must be their mentality. And yet when people go from these places to other societies with different institutional frameworks, they seem to have no problem adapting to these new, this new framework. I will just say very quickly, I guess I see culture as something that cultural norms are something you adhere to when the cost is low, if it's something you like. But if the cost of adhering to a cultural norm becomes too high, people will change their cultural views. They don't cling to them at their own peril, at their own detriment.
These change over time.
These
These costs, very broadly conceived, these change over time, and sometimes they can change in the short run, and sometimes they do not change over the long run.
Agreed.
Yeah, and this whole process of how people make this decision, how the cost changes, and how people get to know about this, is often described in terms of sort of inheritance of social institutions from some historical periods to other historical periods, and I really like Max's example because it speaks directly to the next and the final question, final simple question I'm going to ask, and we have about 5 minutes to address it. Is this very connection between the past and the present? Because we are all, some people are curious in our field because it's just very interesting to study history. Sometimes we study history to test big social hypotheses, but sometimes we want to get something from history to learn about what should we do today, and is there any correlation between what we observe in history with what is happening today. So perhaps you can, in a very tentative and speculative manner, say something in favor of against this idea that we can really learn something meaningful about what is happening today with us in our society, contemporary Western and Eastern societies, and given the knowledge you know from your fields of study, do you observe any inheritance or correlation in the processes you study?
Can I say I looked yesterday in preparation for my talk tomorrow at the differences in GDP per capita in East and Western Europe today and in the past meaning 140 years ago, so in 1880. And if I look at the 1880 map, there are certain countries that stand out as being richer than others. And there's a very strong correlation between those that were rich in 1880 and those that are rich today. And oppositely, those that were poor in the past are relatively poor today as well. And that, to me, is a very strong sign that if you want to predict in 1880 what's going to happen in the future, what things look like before 1880 is a very strong indication. So I think history matters perhaps even more than we think in this context.
Are we trapped?
Yes. No, not in the really long run. The really long run. I'm talking about hundreds of years. There might be.
Well, let me take up Jacob's point. I entirely agree. If one looks at the 1870 map and then the 1970 map and then perhaps one from 2019, there are some striking similarities in the coloring of those maps. What is interesting, we could even observe some of these striking differences at the well below nation level, so even at the regional level in Europe. But of course, as always, history is a bit more complicated than we like it to be. And that is the case. We find then some parts of Europe, doesn't matter whether that's France or Germany or Scandinavia, where some of the regions have managed to get out of a low activity equilibrium and do so relatively quickly, whereas others just stayed where they were. But that is exactly the question which is interesting for policy practitioners these days. How come that some parts managed, despite the fact that they had very similar institutional arrangements, at least macro-institutional arrangements, if we think about the legal order and that sort of thing. So some parts of a country or a region were quite successful economically over a period of 100 years, far more so than others, despite the fact that the macro-institutional arrangements were very, very similar. Now that then raises the question about how shall we weight the relative importance of institutions, the relative importance of culture, the relative importance, say, of geography. Geography, again, broadly conceived as first and second nature geography. I think the real problem that we as historians struggle with is we all probably do recognize that cultural norms and customs, and most certainly formal institutions, that they matter in the sense that they have an impact on how people behave, how they behave to each other, and what the economic consequences of that are. But it's very, very tricky to separate them out. That is what I think we all, to measure them and to separate them out. So sometimes it is quite useful, I believe, for historians, if they want to have some influence on policy debates, to be very, very precise about what they think historical analysis can actually add to policy analysis, and be very, very clear to say where this is not the case.
Sure. Tracy, do you want to add
We're
anything?
in the explaining business, not the predicting
Yeah,
business.
yeah.
But maybe, yes.
So it seems like in Ukraine we have a consensus after reading a lot of Asimoglu and Weber. We know what to do. We should convert
Be
to
careful.
Protestant
Be very careful.
and to install British institutions. So,
No problem.
yes. So with that, I think it would be nice to follow up with the questions from the audience. I already see two hands, so perhaps you. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'm Elise Brzis, and I'm mostly an economic theorist, not only an economic historian, and I would like to add something to what was said. When you asked the question about why there is the word of catching up, institutions versus geography, we have to understand that the theory has changed a lot. First, we spoke about catching up because the theory of economic growth sees it in a very simple way. You are at the beginning in a Solovian economic growth, meaning that you are increasing in a simple way using the other type, the knowledge that is already known, and therefore there is catching up, and you just need to have more factors of productions, usually capital, and today some human capital. And therefore it is called catching up because everybody has in his head the Solovian growth, where in fact when savings rates and fertility rates are not too different between countries that are similar, you will have exactly the same way of movement like the other countries. And therefore there was the word catching up before Abramovich, Gerschenkron. We should speak about it. And then, when you are finishing this period, you move to what we called the Rommel idea of technology, that then you are moving with the other countries at the frontier, and then you need something different, that is creativity, and then you need to produce new technologies. And it's very clear that the countries in Eastern Europe are still in the first period. But what is very interesting is that in the last 10 years, there is a main change in the way economists understand growth. It is the terminology of multiple equilibria. And multiple equilibria can explain what you were asking about, are you in a trap? Or the notion of past dependence, why the past is influencing the future. In a Solovian model, you cannot explain it. And therefore, there are those new theories explaining that it is because you have multiple equilibria, and you can be in a low equilibrium versus a high equilibrium, which is influenced by what we call epsilon, meaning very small things will have huge effects. And if you don't take that into consideration, you are just not understanding the difference between most of the countries. What was said until the 1980s in theory has been completely changed by the new one about multiple equilibria.
It seems like it was rather a statement than a question, but
Absolutely.
I guess I will ask our panel whether you agree with that or not. It would be the very first question I can ask.
Yeah, actually.
It's a very fair point.
No, because this is a theory now.
Yeah. I would even go further. I think the issue of creativity is not just an issue that affects society once they are out of the, shall we say, the high fertility, high nuptiality phase. But that speaks a little bit to when I say something about that tomorrow too, about what was probably one of the core issues in Eastern Europe throughout the 19th century. That what historians like Heinal described as the non-European demographic pattern, which imposed a very, very high price in terms of growth on Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century. I think that's...
Can I add to the catching up point, which I think is really good? When you have multiple equilibria, you can have catching up, but the question is to what equilibrium are you catching up? And thinking about Eastern Europe, that might be a situation, and then you can have all the catching up you want, but you're not going to get there.
Absolutely.
There's a ceiling.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your clarification and your statement, and I think there was also a gentleman who wanted to ask a question.
So I would like to ask Mr. Schulze, please. What model would you recommend for Ukraine? And do you think that Ukraine is so we are so European-centered? We are thinking, so news and so on. We are just centered only on Europe, but maybe we have some Asiatic characteristics of our society. Psychologically, we are, and maybe genetically, we are. For sure, because we have also villages who are Tartars live in a village of pure Tartars is living here, Mongols, you know. Knowing Ukraine, so knowing not only economically maybe, but also socially, what model would you recommend for Ukraine? And there is a book by Joe Studwell, I think you must have read it. And would you recommend us these three things? So finance under strict control of the government, then rather equally distribution of land, to start with, and then industrialization. Would you say it would work for Ukraine, as we have not yet found, and there are disputes, especially when there is this presidential campaign, we are looking for this model, and our presidential candidates that usually are so shy as to give their economic platform. Thank you.
Yeah, I think sometimes we need to take courage to say what kind of models should be.
To be quite frank, give me this long
list of... First of all, to end, have you read the book by Joe Studwell, How Asia Works? And what do you think?
I haven't, so I should be very careful. I should be very careful to comment on its content. But on a more general, I fear I have to disappoint you. I'm not even half competent in current Ukrainian economic affairs and would not dare to offer any model or comment on models that people have suggested may be appropriate or may not be appropriate.
He's
so modest.
I think I should not dwell on things about which I know very little.
Maybe your colleagues.
But finance under state control strikes me as a high-risk strategy. Let me just say that.
Or maybe your colleagues.
You'll go out on that.
The model that I see and
for Ukraine, social economic
let me try.
model for Ukraine.
Let me try, because I've spent a day and a half in Ukraine. So you must know that what I say now is based on that experience.
Careful now, Jacob.
Thank you, Max, for your warning. I would say that if you get a reward for your incentive, then that's the best model.
He didn't take too much risk.
It's a high risk.
Authoritarian behavior is quite rewarded, I think, so. And incentivized. Well...
But that's why I didn't elaborate.
anyways, You see, sometimes we need to have this courage to apply our historical knowledge and to propose models of the development. We have one more question from a gentleman.
I will speak in Ukrainian, so please use the headset. When we speak about catching up, just a second. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? So my question is, when we talk about this catching up in economic terms, what about you as historians and economists, and also based on certain cultural traditions, can you give the answer? What would be the consequence? What will be the final target of catching up? This is like, I remember from my Soviet school times, the development of civilization is about 15,000 of the nuclear warheads that the humankind developed. This is like 50 times destroying the life on the planet. That was at least the target, the final goal that I remember from the school years. But what about the other targets?
The general question is, what's the point? Yes,
well, may I just start with, I think economists and economic historians would not think that creating the capacity to destroy the world several times over would be a particularly useful aim to go for. Rather, I think we want to conceive this in relatively broad terms, and that is, well, at least I would do so, that is a significant narrowing down in income differentials between different parts of the world. Whether that is now up to the level of 75% of the richest nation in the world or up to 90% is not so much the issue. I think the issue is far more to think about under which conditions is it possible for relatively poor parts or relatively rich, relatively poor parts to get closer to the kind of material living conditions that relatively rich societies enjoy. I think it does not matter materially whether that's 100% be on the same standard or a little bit below, but whether there is a movement towards similar standards of material standards of living. That does not necessarily mean that everyone will be happy. You can be living in a poorer society and be a lot happier than living in a very rich society. But I think on that, apart from some economists who work on happiness, most economic historians at the moment would probably be a little bit cautious.
I think before moving to the next question, I should kind of clarify. It seems to me that the audience perceives this definition of catching up in terms of particular policies, that a particular government has to catch up to something, therefore has to choose a model, the best country to catch up in Asia or in Europe, or may, and what is the point, what is the motivation of doing that? Instead, here on this table, economic historian thinks about catching up as a just empirical regularity, just empirical fact that we observe in our data. If we look in the data, we sometimes see that some countries tend to follow those that are more advantageous. So I think this kind of a confusion generated an interesting debate still. So we can provide a debate even out of confusion. So, and we have one more question there.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I have just somehow my questions related to your comment about data. It seems to me that we somehow assume that when we're talking about catching up, we know where we are now and where we want to be. But in any time, whatever it means about, whatever you think about Eastern Europe in general, but in Eastern Europe, somehow data is a crucial point, because sometimes it's really difficult to understand where we are now, or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, just because we don't have enough data, and we try to apply more or less modern methodology to collect data or to analyze it, but it anyway is derived from our Western, whatever it is, experience. And we somehow try to combine sometimes things that eventually produce some data that can be a little bit misleading for us when we are trying to think about catching up. Okay, we can understand where we want to be right now, but where we are now. So that's my question about data, what do you think about it? Thank you.
Yeah, can I back to the catching up question? So, and Lisa's point that if there are multiple equilibria, you don't want. Which one do you want to catch up to? Is the first one. The second is, why don't you aim for an equilibrium that's beyond anything that you've seen before? I mean, we tend to think that we should catch up to the leader, but the leader is at a certain stage, and they have a history that took them there. Would it make sense, and I'm speaking very theoretically now, I guess, to think even further ahead and say we should go for that equilibrium, and that might mean restructuring society in a much more dramatic way in just trying to organize it so that you catch up to the nearest leader or the leader a bit further away. So really rethink the way you construct society.
Just to add, Yelena, to the historical point you were making, I think in the periods we study, you're right that catching up wasn't something, it wasn't really a goal in the way we're talking about it. It was catching up as in, I want an army as good as theirs, and I want to extract more surplus from my population, and so maybe we should build some of those mills they've got over there and see if we can extract some of this. It's only now that we know how we can measure these things and we have data that we even think about catching up and then applying this to the past. So I think, yeah, I see what your point was there.
I wholeheartedly agree with the point that Tracy just made. I think a word of warning, I think it does not help from an analytical point of view, both in terms of historical analysis, but also thinking about the policy to have a rather mechanistic view about what it is. It's not just about turning a few adjustment screws here or there and then picking the kind of level a society wants to aspire to, or even picking one of the equilibria and then adjust policy to that. I think that is misleading to think in those terms. What I think makes more economic sense, and here I come to the point that Jacob made earlier, is to think about some of the fundamentals that we have good reason to believe were playing an instrumental role in the very long run in the relative success of those economies that now, just as much, say that 100 years ago, were doing pretty well by international standards. And think about what are the fundamentals. It's not a good idea, here I come to Jacob, to disincentivize people, to restrict their freedom of action. It is not a good idea to impose constraints on property rights. There may be some cases where sometimes it may be unavoidable. If we think, for instance, about capital controls in post-World War II Europe, it was not necessarily a bad thing. It worked for a while and then it was done away with because it was unavoidable. But in principle, to get some of the basics right, the right incentives, a legal order that is recognized by members of society as being legitimate and fair in the broadest sense, so that trust is built up between members of society, that they do not waste their time on bribing their neighbor just to get a car fixed, something like that, is bound to have positive effects. To have a tax system that is transparent and not obviously discriminating certain activities against others. Yeah, that sort of thing, I think, matters probably more than trying to think in a mechanistic way of how do we get from here to that. I know this is not a very satisfying answer, but I would be, as an economic historian, extremely careful to say, this is what you have to do. I think we probably know a bit more about what one should not do than what one should do.
Sometimes this is more than enough. And I think we have time to take two more questions, one from you and one from you.
It was not a question, it was to answer. I understood the question a little bit differently. I understood the fact that some people will say, yes, economic historians and economists you are speaking and you are using data, but the data is wrong. I felt that
A little bit.
I felt that
very often in Eastern Europe.
that was your question. Well, about that we can say that first we do our best, but we have to understand that, and you had a kind of, when you were speaking, I felt that you were also saying maybe there is some manipulation of what we want to say by using the data. So we have a lot of help now from technology about data. For instance, one of the good proxies that we have for GDP per capita, if you don't like it, is in fact from the satellites we get now the lights. And we know, and it's a perfect correlation with GDP per capita. And you know, satellites are not manipulating data. So, in fact, and we have data back for many centuries, so in fact we know that economists and economist historians are doing a good job. And we shouldn't be so much afraid of using the data that we have and saying it was manipulated. I think that we do really a good job. And I completely agree with what Jacob said, and Max and Tracy agreed with, that if there is one thing that we learn now from history and from economic theory, is that incentives, it's maybe the most important idea of that economists have developed, meaning put the right incentives and then you will get the economy working in a better way than thinking that you are going to manipulate it, to force it, and just to decide the laws, because the people like, in fact, freedom for the people. It's the way to get the economy working well.
Thank you very much for your great comment. Please.
Anna Salisbury, thank you for letting me ask a question. And following on from Max's point, in terms of trust and having deep institutional logics and institutions that work, so people trust the systems, I think is essential. But I think there's a chance here for some scientific humility. Those of you who are old enough, like me, sadly, to remember the immediate period in the early 1990s when the US and people like Sachs went into the former Soviet Union with prescriptions about how to actually get a market economy going. And the law of unintended consequences kicked in. You're all experts in this field, so you understand what I'm talking about. And the importance of path dependency and work by David Stark, so it's over 30 years now, we start to see some patterns that there's a lot more about bricolage going on. People take bits of the past and work with it in order to try and make the future. But it's very uncertain, and there's a normative assumption behind some of the questions that things can be fixed and levers can be pulled. And I think you can observe the consequences of actions, but I think it's quite a challenging statement to presume that one can influence human behaviour. And moreover, aspiring to become, I put this in quotation marks, to be more Western in terms of wealth. The sad news is this is a moving target, and the wealth is disappearing rapidly over to the east. So you now have India's superpower in China. So in my country, United Kingdom, we have quite a wild form of capitalism, quite precarious jobs. So GDP, knock yourself out. But if you're an ordinary worker, it isn't such a wonderful thing. So the phenomenon is much more complex. And it's much harder for working people, as it is in the Ukraine, to actually get on in terms of social mobility. And I think I'll stop at this point because there are more experts in economic history than I. There's just a few comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to comment on any observations or suggestions that were passed.
No, I think this is a perfectly fair comment. If we think, for example, what are the where's world income generation and wealth generation moving to spatially? The center of the action does not appear to be any longer Western Europe, or not to the same extent that it may have been 10 to 20 years ago. I think it's also a very fair comment to say that Western, take this or read this from your comment, that within Western societies that have been quite successful in terms of, say, GDP per capita, that there are issues of income and wealth inequality which probably have not lessened but rather became worse over the last 10 to 20 or so years. I'm taking that fully on board. It does not necessarily mean, though, that you should give up thinking in terms of what makes macroeconomics or macroeconomies more productive. In other words, how can societies increase the cake that is being distributed amongst the members of that society? So I take your points fully on board, but I don't quite think that it goes as far as saying, well, you economic historians or you macroeconomists bothering about GDP and the aggregate economy, let's forget about that, let's focus on the distributional end of things. I think that is probably, would be over-egging the cake. I'm not egg the cake. I'm not suggesting that this is what you do, but I just want to underline the
You're
point.
such an optimist.
We have another optimist in the room.
Yeah, okay, thank you. You know what, we're in the Center for Urban History, and here many people who are interested in urban history, obviously. So my question is about relationship between these two fields, economic history and urban history. What is going on there? And can you probably point some good ideas and concepts which urban historians should take into consideration? Thank you.
That's a tricky one, especially for someone who doesn't know anything about urban history. But my sort of gut feeling would be that if you start somewhere making changes, it's probably a better idea making them in an urban setting than in a rural setting, especially if you think about one of the resources that I think is maybe the strongest here in Ukraine, based again on my 1.5 days spent here, and that's human capital. Because you seem to be a country of really smart people. I know I was put straight in the university, and maybe that's a biased group, but you have not only people that are eager to get education, you have also people that are eager to get education, even though the outlook of a reward from that education is really small. And when you have such a strong incentive to educate, then that seems like a force. And so if you start that in the urban area, I'm sure it will spread across the country eventually.
I agree with that.
Good.
But I'm going to say something about, actually, if I may, about the sort of the non-durée, the kind of longer historical context. So just some observations. Rural and urban is a contrast that's often made. I have heard people argue, well, Eastern Europe, you know, part of the problem is they didn't have any cities, and they don't have any cities. And yes, that is true. By comparison with Western Europe, there were very few substantial towns and cities in Eastern Europe. But there were also a lot of good reasons for this, structural, right? So where you have serfdom, you have mobility restrictions, and so people can't actually up and go to the cities. Where you have towns and cities that are corporate entities, that are chartered places, and citizenship rules for who can live in a city, you're not going to get that many cities. It turns out that those are also things that prevent places from developing economically and from growing. And so the lack of cities is a symptom of a number of underlying structural features that keep urban populations from growing and also keep agricultural productivity from growing, because people are stuck in the countryside, they don't have other options. And so I think, at least in the pre-modern period, that's at least one way I've looked at it in the past.
Yeah, but if I may just add to that point, I share this, but perhaps one could push this even further. And here I think is the connection between the past and the present. What are cities particularly good at? Cities are particularly good at bringing people together. And if people are brought together, in all likelihood, the chances of an individual's productivity to be higher in an urban setting than in a small town is very, very high, and has been so probably for a couple of 100 years. Leaving aside agricultural production, but in virtually every other area of activity, face-to-face contact, the chance to speak with those people and work with those people who are good at what they're doing is likely to, ceteris paribus, to increase productivity. We can see that in universities. If we want to view a university as a small city, why do people want to go to particular universities? Because they meet other people who are interested in similar problems, who may be quite smart, and you can learn from them, and thus you can increase your own productivity. That is something which I think we can historically observe, and which we can observe these days. How come that in the age of the World Wide Web, we could easily sit somewhere on an island of the Shetland Islands and communicate with financial market participants all over the world, where we first thought that would be one of the consequences, where everyone would, that the activity would disperse. But exactly the opposite has happened. Economic activity becomes ever more concentrated in space. You know, all these London city boys and girls, well, they want to talk face to face with each other. So I think cities have a set of properties that likely lead to ever more, not unconditional, but on balance, to more agglomeration, and therefore probably larger gains to be had from further urbanization. Of course, at some stage, disamenities come in, urban disamenities. And if we look at the size of the biggest European cities at the moment, there's probably still space for a bit more growth. So here I think there's a wonderfully direct connection between urban history and economic history, and between urban history and economic history on the one hand, and urban and economic development in the present.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. We will be gradually moving to the end of our event. So first of all, just a few more words I'd like to say, and I want to say, Jakob, that you are profoundly wrong. It's not about the bias of university. Ukrainians are naturally smart people. So, I really enjoyed
Then I was right in the end.
I really enjoyed our conversation today. I always love a conversation where I know where to start it, but I never know how it's going to end. I did not anticipate so many interesting concepts to pop up today, and of course wonderful comments and suggestions from the audience. At least a few messages that we can take away from our conversations were raised today. I think the issue of incentives is very important, and the sociological literature agrees. I think the major development and evolution of sociology was that about 20 years ago we borrowed the concept of incentives from your field, and this really boosted the development of social science, so thank you on behalf of the whole sociological literature. And before we will end this evening, I still want to ask Jakob one question. I will not let you off the hook so easily. I want you to say a few words about the WIST initiative, about your motivation to work with this initiative, and what have you achieved and what are your plans? Perhaps you can say a few words about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this initiative, which is called the WIST, and that means West meets East. And the idea is that there are a lot of Western European scholars who are interested in Eastern European data, but have a difficult time assessing it. On the other hand, you have a lot of Eastern European scholars who are interested in learning Western methodologies, learning how to publish in Western journals, and so on. So we created this initiative, which has an annual meeting taking place in different European countries each year, where scholars from the West and the East can meet and discuss their research and present their ideas. And I think we have organized 5, 6, maybe more meetings. I've stopped counting at this point. And if you're interested in the topics I mentioned, if you're interested as a scholar or maybe even a private person to come and participate in these meetings, of course, we would be delighted to have you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jakob. Max, Tracy, thank you all for your contributions. And of course, thank you to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Enjoy your evening.